Charting Toward Intimacy covers mature topics. Listener discretion is advised. Charting Toward Intimacy covers mature topics. Listener discretion is advised. Hey there, welcome to Charting Toward Intimacy, where we're expanding the natural family planning conversation. I'm your host, Ellen Holloway. Last week, we had part one of this conversation with Melissa Buchan about IVF. And so we are going to jump right into the second half of our conversation, where we are going to be discussing a little bit more the moral theological implications of IVF. So be sure to go back to last week if you haven't listened to that episode and get the first half of this conversation, and then come back here and listen to the second half.
Yeah, I mean, let's jump over there right now. We can always kind of jump back to a couple more physical things if we think of them. But yeah, this moral aspect of IVF, there's a lot going on that like just on so many levels of the entire procedure of IVF that just doesn't make sense when we truly understand a couple of things, when we understand the purpose of sex, when we understand life, when we understand, how God created us and how God uses us and our love to create life. So, if we just jump back to the beginning and you were talking about like masturbation, there's your first red flag, right? And we know that that's not illicit. Oh gosh, it's so hard to say that. Not a licit activity. For a lot of reasons, but the first being that the act of, goodness gracious, I'm just going to go there. The act of ejaculation should happen in a sexual act. And like that's in the Bible in like a lot of different spots. And so when we try to do that outside of intercourse, we have a serious problem because
and we have a serious problem, not just in IVF, but look at where our world is in the area of human sexuality. I always say, the devil takes what is good and beautiful and true and twists it into a whole variety of lies. And so we could probably just reach into a hat and whether, I'm not going to list them all, but there are so many. And so if we can't get this right, I feel like there's just so much hypocrisy in talking or placing judgment of people who may not understand. For example, people who maybe are struggle with same-sex attraction. Like, who are we to judge them if we can't get this right? Because it's all the same underlying principles.
Right. Like, and these underlying principles are that we are created male and female. God created us for a community. God created us for that unity. And that unity then creates life out of love. And so if we're struggling with just that basic aspect, then we don't even understand outside of that realm, like, right, same-sex attraction, masturbation, things like that. It's like, it's hard to even understand why those might even be wrong if we're not understanding really
the basics.
The basics point of sex, really.
So let's talk about like, what are the basics when we're looking at it of like, what are we as Catholics called to? So first of all, it's recognizing God created sex and he created it to be a beautiful and good thing. And with a twofold purpose, bonding and babies, very, very simple. And so every full active intercourse is called to be both procreative and unitive. And then the third thing that I want to mention here in the context is that we are all called to chastity, married people, single people, people with same-sex attractions, all of us. Now, how you live out chastity looks different depending on what your vocation in life is, but we are all called to that standard. And until we are personally living that, which is a hard line to toe, I get that. I get that. But if we are seeking something outside of ourselves and something higher, that should always be at the forefront, that we're striving for chastity. And I'm not saying that, shame on you if you're not 100%, because I don't think perfection is attainable.
That's why we have confession.
Yes. Oh, so we're all striving for that. So then coming back to, okay, the bonding and the babies. So when we talk about contraception, well, guess what? We're taking the babies out of the equation. With IVF, we're taking the bonding out of the equation. So it's no longer the self-giving act between a husband and a wife, the complete giving of self. That's removed. Right. That's what makes IVF morally objective.
Right. And I've said this before on the podcast, like God created sex to be, or that allows us to be co-creators with God to create life out of love. And so IVF is taking that love part away. I mean, sure, you might be thinking that you're doing it out of love, but that love as in the unity part of the sexual act that is creating the life is just completely removed. Right. And so, so we talk about contraception a lot on this podcast. And it's really easy to, I think, after you hear it a lot, right, you understand, okay, I'm taking the babies part out. That's not good. I shouldn't have the bonding part without the babies, but we can't do it the other way either. And that's exactly what IVF does.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's such a sensitive topic because, you mentioned like taking out the love. I really think that couples who are going through the IVF process, that's not their intention. And so this is right. Like a typical, like they're not intending, and they're actually doing something out of love that's very difficult, very painful, very expensive because of that really deep and beautiful desire to have a child. And that is something that if you have had that placed on your heart, you know what that desire feels like. And if that is taken from you, or that's something that you're really, that you feel it's not in your control, it's a very, very painful experience. And so I never want to diminish the pain that a couple struggling with infertility goes through. It is an incredibly painful, and it can be a very dark journey as well. So it's always important to get support and help, so that you can really think about what it is that you're hoping and envisioning for yourself and for your future family. And then with a well-formed conscience, how can you travel that often undesirable path?
Right. That is such a good point. I'm really glad that you brought that up because, this is something I personally have never struggled with. And so I think it's really easy to speak in a certain way without taking things into consideration. And yes, what I meant saying, taking the love part out is the unity of the sexual act.
Absolutely. No,
not that love is not a part of any of these decisions. Absolutely. Yes.
Well, and that's the beautiful part about our faith of like God becoming incarnate, is that there are some very, like in the sacraments, right? In the Eucharist, like there are physical signs of invisible realities. And that's why a marriage is a sacrament. And that anytime a man and a woman, a husband and wife, come together in marital intercourse, there's sacramental grace there. I mean, it's conferring the sacrament. It's an invisible sign of a visible sign of an invisible reality. So I don't think you misspoke at all. There's a physical aspect of the love. I would just also kind of touch point on the emotional well-being side of it as well, because This is a complex and very delicate, intricate topic. I mean, there, again, we could talk for hours, I'm sure, about all of the things involved around this process.
Right. Well, and what you mentioned, I think, again, we can't say this enough. Like if this is something that you are struggling with, or if this is something that a doctor has suggested to you, it is really important to find support. Speak with trusted friends, speak with your pastor, speak with a spiritual advisor, these kind of people. And then, go find a restorative reproductive doctor, speak with them, find out, what other options there are available.
And I want to interject here real quick, just before we get off topic, is that, if you have a child who was conceived through IVF, or you are a child that was conceived through IVF, that doesn't mean that you're no less of a dignified human than any other person. Like your dignity is still there 100%. You were created in the image and likeness of God. And this is where it makes it such a difficult process. That doesn't mean that we can say that the process is okay, but you are absolutely 100% okay. And so there is absolutely no guilt associated with how, that was out of your control. And if it's a process that you went through because you weren't well informed, well, that's okay too, because you didn't know what you didn't know.
Right. Right. And that's an opportunity to go and bring that to confession now that you know, and move forward and then help us spread the word.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, yeah, absolutely. That's, those are the beautiful stories that really, are the change-making stories in today's world.
Yes. So I think something I want to touch on next is the idea of control, because I think that's kind of where IVF fits into this. It's like, okay, my husband and I aren't getting pregnant. I deserve this. I can control this. I want, I want to get pregnant. And we as Catholics, we know we're not, we don't deserve anything. Like, we're not guaranteed anything in our lives. And so when we try to step in, especially in something as important as the sexual act and the creation of life, when we try to step in and control that process, either if we're on the side of not having a baby, if we're trying to control it with birth control, or if we're on this side of really trying to have a baby and we're trying to like control it outside of its natural process, then we run again into some moral implications.
Yeah, we absolutely do. And this is where, the work I do with clients, I do integrated health coaching, health and wellness coaching. Integrated meaning we talk about the integrated self, and spirituality is one component of that. And so if it really comes back to where you are in your spiritual journey, in your relationship with God, in your awareness of who you are as a child of God. And until you can really come to understanding of that, or be willing to deepen that aspect of your integrated self, it makes the other conversations very difficult around control. There's nothing wrong with wanting to be in control of life, of setting goals, setting vision boards. Nothing wrong with that.
Right. Absolutely.
But it has to be within proper context of who we are and don't have control of. I think sometimes we can play mind games with ourselves on what it ultimately is that we have control of, with charting your cycle, using a natural family planning to either avoid or achieve a pregnancy. That does put women and couples in control of making informed decisions about their reproductive goals. To kind of just, that's right. Kind of a very pragmatic way to put it. But that's really what we're looking at. But at the same time, there's variability there, and there's always an openness. And this kind of goes down to, we're talking, first we'll talk about like that whole control area in the area of NFP, and what, we often hear of as a contraceptive mentality. Mm-hmm. And, there will be critics out there who will say, well, you're contracepting just by your mentality. Well, actually, no, you're not contracepting, because contracepting is to put a barrier against life. Right. And so it's right.
It's not possible to contracept
if you're just not doing anything.
Yeah, exactly.
You're not precipitating. And I had a priest explain this to me once, that really when I was struggling with this concept and how to work through it for myself and for the couples I was working with, it's to abstain during a fertile time is not contracepting, but at best it's being selfish, right? You could be very selfish.
Yeah, you can be selfish in practicing NFP.
But not contracepting.
Yeah, it's not possible to contracept.
Yeah. And so there's the whole, so that I would say would be a lot of what maybe the struggle is with couples who are working to practice NFP, is this idea of selfishness and just constantly discerning what's the best for you and your family. And that really is a conversation between you, your spouse, and God. And that's it. Just constantly working at that well-formed conscience. But so then we go to the flip side with IVF, and it's very difficult, because you've got this desire for a family. You feel out of control. And especially if you've been somebody who has been charting and maybe things look kind of normal, or you thought you were in control all of this time, and really it's not going the way that you thought it was. And then again, when we look at this, I just think naturally there comes the kind of visceral response to not being in control of fertility is panic and desperation.
Mm-hmm.
We feel like we're ticking clock, like our biological clock is ticking, and that we're running out of time, whether that be first time pregnancy or the spacing of children with secondary infertility. And so really, again, I'm just coming back to like that integrated self of focusing on spirituality and being able to let go of things when they're not necessarily going your way, but always coming back to that vision of who you are, what you desire for yourself and your family, and what you can do that's within your power to get there, and what things you have to surrender.
Right. And kind of understanding the difference between working within the bounds that God has given us and working outside of the bounds that God has given us. Right. And so if we go back to like the element of control with NFP, we are in that case, if we're trying to avoid a pregnancy, we are working right within the bounds that God has naturally given us. He's naturally given us all of these signs of fertility that we can relatively easily chart and interpret. Sometimes it's a little harder than others. And, God has given us that because he knew at some point in our civilization, we would need to space pregnancies for some reason. And so we're taking a look at the natural signs that God has given us. We're not inserting anything into that process other than just kind of knowledge. Whereas if you then go look at IVF, you can see the many different spots where you're really just like taking control and taking it out of the context that God has designed for us, right? So we have the masturbation aspect that's taking something that's very important to intercourse. You're taking it outside of intercourse. Then you have the aspect of taking the eggs out of the body, which they're not really supposed to come out of the body until birth, and they're not an egg anymore. You're taking them outside of the body, and then you're like putting them back in. And so you can really just physically see how we're really removing these aspects from this natural design that the Lord has given us. Whereas with other methods of restoring fertility, they're not, we're not taking eggs out to then manipulate them. We are taking a look at the body and going inside and saying, okay, what can we fix inside? Maybe that's lifestyle changes. Maybe it does require a surgery. But again, we're not like removing the actual creation of life process from inside of the body, which I think is one of the most important spots.
I think that is important as well. As I went through kind of the step-by-step process of what IVF looked like, I'm sure many of the listeners would agree that it's a very medicalized process.
Mm-hmm.
But that in and of itself isn't a bad thing. It's that it's removing the bonding aspect. When we're talking about restorative approaches to fertility, there are some very gentle therapies. Lifestyle goes a long way. But there are also very medicalized procedures as well. So a couple working through a restorative protocol, when we say restorative, it's because we're trying to restore the natural process of ovulation in the woman. And so with restorative medicine, a lot of times it is that there's some type of dysfunction that is hijacking the ovulatory process. Ovulation is a high energy process. So if your energy is being utilized for another reason in the body, whether it's fighting disease or, unbalanced cortisol or whatever it is, ovulation is probably going to be kind of crummy. But there are processes, again, lifestyle, but also medications that you take and processes that you go through that are all still within the medical and ethical confines of making it morally acceptable. So again, it's some of the same medications that are used for IVF, but at a much gentler kind of therapeutic level to stimulate a healthy ovulation. There again, with sperm analysis, there are ways so that you can collect a sperm sample within a normal act of intercourse. so that you can have that analyzed and evaluated to make sure that there isn't anything as far as the male aspect of fertility that needs to be evaluated or improved.
Right. That's such a good point. There's not something wrong with the medical procedure of it, right? There are many medical procedures that exist that are definitely, morally illicit. There's not something wrong with getting a medical procedure. But it's when we take a look at what is the medical procedure doing, it is taking away a very important aspect of the creation of life. And that's that bonding. It's taking the bonding aspect out. It is creating life outside of the body and then trying to put it back in and kind of, I don't know. It kind of seems like the doctors just cross their fingers and hope it works.
Well, and with the advent of all of this, then it's okay. Well, if we take the sperm and the egg for Mr. and Mrs. Jones and create a baby for them, why can't we take the egg for Mrs. Smith and the sperm from Mr. Jones and put them together? So this idea of, sperm donors, so right. that you may have a child with outside of the confines, you're inserting genetic material from outside of the family union. This is different than adoption, right? Like people will say, well, if you're adopting, no, adoption is a totally different process than egg adoption or sperm donation. And so there's that whole kind of Pandora's box to look at too. Adoption is an absolutely beautiful opportunity for couples to discern if they are struggling with infertility. It is a discernment process, and every couple struggling with infertility, I invite them to discern that process if that's the path to building their family that God is calling them to. I think when we're talking about this, I don't want to kind of go down a rabbit hole, but when we're talking about adoption, we really have to, again, be that self-sacrificial place of, even though I desire in my heart to have a child, and typically women want to birth their own child, but ultimately it's to have a child. It's not to fulfill my desire to have a child, but to give myself to provide a loving home and to give a child a good shot at life. And that's, I think, where we can insert that conversation of adoption, of maybe they don't have the opportunity for that, or they're being placed up for adoption for whatever reason, and you're inviting that into your home. And so it's a very intricate conversation, but it's not to feel that desire in your heart. But when you have that desire, you can start to think outside of yourself. How can I give myself? And this desire for motherhood and for parenthood, how can I self-sacrifice so that I can be love? Because that's what marital love is, the giving of oneself. How can I be love for another? And oftentimes it's amazing the beautiful gifts that adoption will present themselves. And I share this, I'm an adopted person. And so I, I was definitely kind of an oops. I was a unplanned pregnancy, definitely contemplated abortion, and my biological mother chose life for me. And I was placed into my family through that desire of taking that desire and that pain of infertility and then reversing it to, okay, well, what can we welcome in to help heal this wound that we're experiencing?
Yes. Oh, what a beautiful way to put it, because if the entire process of parenthood it's just a self-sacrificial love. And so you starting with like the marital act, we are self-sacrificing to our spouse. We are giving our entire selves over. And that just continues through the whole process. Through pregnancy is plenty of self-sacrifice. And then the whole process of parenthood as well is, there are many, many opportunities for self-sacrifice. And so if we just take a look at, is my process for becoming a parent, am I truly giving my whole self over to my spouse and the Lord and my future children? And so if you can really truly think about those questions and answer those, yes, then you're going to be going in the right direction. And as we've kind of talked about, like IVF doesn't really allow us to answer all of those questions. Yes. Whereas other aspects, right? Adoption absolutely allows us to answer all those questions. Yes.
Yes. And as you go through the process of restorative reproductive medicine, which is kind of the umbrella term, NAPRO is the most common that we see available. NAPRO surgery, as well as NAPRO technology protocols and treatments. And so when a couple or a woman is going down that path, they are going to get answers. And again, this is where the control comes in. It may not be the answer that they want. Sometimes it is, and there's a resolution. But other times, then you know why. You know why you're not able to achieve a pregnancy if ultimately that's not what God is placed for you. And so being able to come to closure with that of, okay, I'm physically not able to get pregnant, to achieve a pregnancy, to maintain a pregnancy. Now, again, with restorative approaches, there's a lot of hope for couples, but I think we have to have a metered conversation about this, that other couples, they will be able to come to closure that my body's not able to do this. We are not able to, as a couple, to do this. And so then opening up that conversation of, well, what does parenthood look for us? We have a desire in our hearts. Is it through adoption? Is it through spiritual parenthood? What does that look like? Whereas, so I work with a lot of couples, Ellen, who, and a lot of women who they come to me after repeated failed IVFs and IUIs, and it's heartbreaking. And it becomes such a part of who they are that they almost, it's hard to open that door to have these other conversations of, well, can we explore your desire for parenthood outside of this process? Like, ultimately, what is your desire? What is your goal for that desire? And so coming at it more holistically and being able to have those difficult but important conversations of, well, what if this doesn't work? And how can we work through this process and come to closure with it so that you can heal those wounds? Because again, it is difficult. It's difficult when your body's not doing what you want it to do,
right?
Especially if those around you, it seems to be working no problem. And so my heart goes out to anybody struggling with any type of reproductive issue, and really any issue around human sexuality. It's, again, such a complex, such a beautiful and deep topic. And we could talk about how they are impacted by their own human sexuality, the joys and the struggles that it brings to the table for them. I'm sure you talk a lot about this with just the struggles of NFP.
Right.
Today, we're talking about the struggles of IVF. So I think it's just one of those natural truths that God has ingrained in us. And because of who we are as fallen creatures, it can strike a chord, and it can be a place of pain for some.
Right. Well, and I think it's also just important to make the note that, like, it's okay to struggle with these things. It's okay to question these things.
Absolutely.
And that's when you need to turn to prayer and spiritual directors and maybe your pastor, just trusted spiritual advisors, in these kind of situations. But it is okay to question these things. Why is this? Why is this not working? Why isn't this okay? Why can't I just do it this way? It's okay to ask those questions, but seek answers for them. Don't just ask those questions and then call it a day.
And that's so important. Ask questions and seek answers. And that's what I would encourage anybody who's struggling in these areas, is to ask questions and to seek answers. Because if we shove it under the rug, ultimately that's just going to cause a lot of pain. It's kind of like, if you ever have like a muscle that's tense that just keeps building up and, causing headaches or whatever in your body, you have to really get in and kind of massage it and work through it. Like, massage those questions, work through them, look for those healing answers.
And there are answers, and there are some great books and different, papal writings and all sorts of things that have those kind of answers. And, I think in a lot of cases, if you find the right spiritual advisor, they can help direct you towards a good book to read to answer those questions, or a good, encyclical to read, and things like that. But yeah, seek those answers. Don't just let that muscle get tighter and tighter and tighter.
Exactly.
Yes. Well, Melissa, I think that this is really a great place for us to wrap up. Was there anything else that you wanted to kind of mention or talk about before we close out?
Well, we talked a lot about a lot today, and this really is a very sensitive and delicate topic. So I just encourage the listeners, like whatever journey that you've been on, just always keep hope at the center. Always keep hope at the center, and that really recognition that first and foremost you're a child of God, and your body is created for a very beautiful and specific purpose, even if it's not operating or behaving in a way that you want it to. It is still beautiful and absolutely made with love and perfection. So I just encourage, all the listeners out there to first and foremost give thanks for their beautiful bodies, get to know their beautiful bodies and how they work. And I really find that once you kind of build this body awareness and body literacy, it really does open up this kind of mindset and how you make decisions, the questions that you ask, and then you just take it from there.
Absolutely. Oh, fantastic. Great note to end on, Melissa. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for listening. If you would like to connect with Melissa, links to connect with her are going to be in the show notes. And then, of course, I always love hearing from you guys and answering your questions or hearing your suggestions. So please feel free to reach out to me via email or on Instagram. Links to those are in the show notes. Until next time.